The story opens at a Brussels airport, where a man named Terenzio hurries with evident agitation. One might assume he's rushing to catch a flight, but his true motive is far more urgent. He inquires about westbound tickets, learning the earliest departure is 2 hours away. Despite the delay, he purchases one simply to gain access to the terminal. Concurrently, at the very same airport, Ines, a well-known online personality, is video conferencing with a friend in New York. Abruptly, her friend begins to choke and loses consciousness. Ines is deeply distressed, powerless to assist. Outside, onlookers watch as television presenters and live show hosts collapse on screen. Beyond that, entire city streets are filled with unconscious individuals. Viewers assume it's a prank, but Terenzio understands the grim reality. Declaring it's time to act, he rushes towards a boarding gate. Seizing a moment when a security guard is distracted, Terenzio grabs his weapon and demands everyone clear his path. He storms a flight minutes from departing for Moscow. Only a partial complement of passengers has boarded when he enters and brandishes the firearm at them. The primary pilot is absent, and the co-pilot, Matthew, resists assisting the armed man. During their struggle over the gun, a shot accidentally wounds Matthew's hand. Outside, passengers are panicking, and flight attendant Gabrielle attempts to calm them. Terenzio emerges from the cockpit, asking if there's any pilot among them. A woman named Sylvie steps forward, revealing she's a retired helicopter pilot. Under Terenzio's command, Sylvie and Matthew take off with the remaining passengers. Bullet damage has compromised the avionics, preventing anyone on board from making outside contact. Once airborne, Sylvie and Matthew try to reason with Terenzio, but he remains unyielding. He identifies himself as a NATO officer, privy to critical information they lack. Pressured to explain, he reveals the sun's rays have become lethal. He explains that starting the next day, sunrise will be fatal to all, even those indoors. This devastating effect has already begun in eastern nations like Japan and Korea. Their aircraft will be next if they're caught by the advancing sun. Matthew and Sylvie express disbelief, suspecting a mental breakdown. Terenzio concedes he might appear foolish, but insists he's not. Matthew's hand is bleeding profusely, a growing concern. Laura, a passenger who works as a home health nurse for an elderly man with dementia, is the only medical person available. She steps up to treat the pilot. Lacking a proper suturing kit, they use a heated knife to cauterize the wound. Matthew cries out in agony, increasing passenger fear. Knowing that panic would jeopardize everyone, Matthew assures them they'll make an initial landing at Terenzio's desired location, then proceed to their original destination. Matthew hopes fighter jets are en route for a rescue, given they were hijacked. Sylvie, however, has a premonition they're on their own. A passenger named Ayaz overhears the talk about the sun and suspects the pilot is deceiving them. Suddenly, an Arab passenger begins to cough and collapses unconscious. Ayaz feigns assistance, snatching Terenzio's weapon in the process. He orders Terenzio locked in the lavatory and instructs Matthew to reveal the truth. The pilot discloses they are headed to Iceland, as Terenzio insisted on flying west. There, law enforcement will apprehend the hijacker and the others will be freed. He also relays Terenzio's theory about the sun's lethal rays. This news sends the passengers into chaos. They recall strange occurrences before their flight and voice fears for their families. Matthew calms them, asserting his responsibility to save them all as captain. Sometime later, he attempts to land at an Icelandic airport but receives no air traffic control signals. As they approach the ground, they see numerous collided aircraft and people scrambling below. They finally grasp that Terenzio's warning was accurate, but the blocked runway prevents landing. With barely enough fuel to reach Scotland, the captain decides to head west and hope for the best. He releases Terenzio from the lavatory to explain the situation. Terenzio reveals he overheard his superiors discussing the sun's deadly effect, but lacks knowledge of its cause or duration. His only certainty is that survival requires constantly outrunning the sunrise. Meanwhile, the Arab passenger who collapsed earlier remains on the floor, struggling to breathe and nearing cardiac arrest. With his last words, he confesses to swallowing diamonds. Nurse Laura's desperate attempts to revive him prove futile. Concurrently, they make an emergency landing in Scotland, where Matthew narrowly stops the plane from colliding with a wall. Outside, their phones ping with notifications from their loved ones in Brussels. The internet is flooded with news of lethal sunlight. Half the world has perished, the other half awaits their fate. The airport is deserted, as those who could escape have fled, and others hide in darkness hoping for protection. However, news reports indicate people are dying even in fortified shelters. Suddenly, 3 RAF servicemen approach, requesting assistance. With only 45 minutes until sunrise, they plan to gather vital supplies and continue flying west. Yakub, a passenger who is an aircraft engineer, wishes to return to his pregnant wife. However, for the safety of all, he is urged to remain. After stocking up on supplies and refueling the plane, they take off once more. One of the servicemen, a pilot, suggests flying away from the equator to slow the sun's relentless pursuit. Their next stop is Canada, where they'll refuel and repair the radio. A while later, the internet connection is restored and their phones light up. They receive final messages from their deceased loved ones in Brussels. Then a man discovers an article attributing the catastrophe to the sun's polarity. Horst, a climate specialist among the passengers, understands the implications of solar polarity. He explains that the sun's magnetic field reverses every 11 years for unknown reasons, typically with no significant earthly impact, thus attracting little research. However, he hypothesizes that decades of weakening reversals led to an exceptionally powerful reversal in the opposite direction. If his theory holds, Earth is being bombarded with lethal gamma rays wherever sunlight touches, causing instantaneous death. They have no means to verify this, as the scientists who published the article are likely all gone. At that moment, Ayaz finds an article identifying the RAF servicemen they picked up as Afghan terrorists that were arrested and being repatriated at the airport. Outside, one of the terrorists argues and shoves the elderly man with dementia, causing his death and earning the passengers condemnation. Sylvie informs Matthew of the news report, and they resolve to abandon the terrorists upon landing. Minutes later, they land with 2 hours until sunrise. Victims of the deadly sunlight litter the city. The terrorists are sent to find radio repair parts at the nearest shop. They agree, but insist on taking Gabrielle and Yakub with them. Yakub is aware of the plan to ditch the terrorists, but Gabrielle is not. So at the shop, when Yakub locks the terrorists in a room, Gabrielle refuses to go with him. Yakub, with no time to persuade her, makes it back to the airport pursued by the terrorists, leaving Gabrielle behind in the city. The airplane departs without her. The terrorists fire at the plane, hitting a window and causing a crack. Fortunately, if they maintain a level altitude, it should hold. Dominic, a terminally ill child, is also on board. Ayaz attempts to engage him in conversation, but his overprotective mother, Zara, dismisses Ayaz. Suddenly, they receive a radio signal from someone in Hawaii. The message is fragmented, but they deduce survivors are in an underwater bunker. Matthew wants to head to Hawaii immediately, but Sylvie deems it reckless to fly based on an unclear message. Terenzio, furious that the captain makes all decisions, protests. The group agrees that all future decisions will be made by vote. Just as calm returns, multiple alarms sound, indicating an aircraft malfunction. After assessing the issues, Matthew realizes one of the terrorists from earlier has attached himself to the landing gear. If he remains, they cannot land. Matthew decides to ascend to a higher altitude, hoping the extreme cold and lack of oxygen will eliminate him. However, he overlooks the cracked window. The pressure differential causes it to shatter, plunging the cabin into chaos. Objects fly as passengers brace for impact. Matthew quickly descends to a lower altitude, and Yakub temporarily seals the window with a wooden board. Everyone calms down, but Dominic struggles to breathe as his respiratory tube was lost. Matthew devises a solution, fashioning a new tube from an oxygen pipe. Zara expresses gratitude and shame for her earlier harshness towards Ayaz. The captain informs them that Hawaii is no longer an option due to the altitude restriction. The most viable landing spot is Attu, an Alaskan island. Additionally, the turbulence failed to dislodge the hanging terrorist. Ayaz, Yakub, and Terenzio venture to the undercarriage, cutting a hole in the plane's floor to view him. Terenzio points his gun into the darkness, but the criminal snatches it, nearly killing him. Ayaz fortunately intervenes, shooting the terrorist dead. Ayaz is hailed as a hero for a brief period until passengers discover he was indirectly responsible for the Arab passenger's death. They recall burying the body in Canada, where someone witnessed Ayaz making an incision in the deceased abdominal. Upon hearing this, some passengers advocate abandoning Ayaz, like the terrorists, but the overall vote favors him. Consequently, he is handcuffed in the avionics bay. In the subsequent scene, they land in Alaska, refuel, and take off once again. Once airborne, the climatologist Horst makes a peculiar observation. The fruits they collected in Canada are flavorless. He hypothesizes that the intense gamma rays are altering the food's atomic structure. The alarming implication is that its nutritional value is diminishing. At this rate, they face starvation within weeks. Matthew acknowledges the threat, but insists their immediate priority is outrunning the sun. He has been noticeably agitated over the past few hours. Sylvie suggests he rest, but he uncharacteristically yells at her. The passengers decide to compel him to rest, escorting him from the cockpit. Though annoyed, Matthew promises to sleep for a few hours. Later, they intercept another radio signal, hearing two parties converse. They only catch Stara 17. They soon realize the speaker is a cosmonaut in space. They are astonished that a cosmonaut is alive, which implies he's communicating with an operational control room on Earth. Renewed with hope, they decide to head for NATO headquarters in Brussels, where their journey began. At their current speed, they'll have 4 hours after landing in Brussels before the sun rises. With Terencio's assistance, they might find information about a secret bunker at the headquarters. Outside, Laura discovers Matthew unconscious in the lavatory. It turns out his hand injury has become severely infected, leading to blood poisoning, which explains his recent erratic behavior. To resolve this, the infected tissue must be amputated. Laura states she can perform the surgery in Brussels if they reach a hospital. However, without Matthew, Sylvie cannot land the plane alone. The passengers plead with her, as she's their closest equivalent to a pilot, but she reiterates her experience is limited to helicopters. Hurst impresses upon her that inaction means everyone's demise. Following this, Sylvie watches several instructional videos on plane landing. Nevertheless, when faced with the actual task, she panics. Aggressive turbulence hits and everyone prepares for the worst. Ultimately, they execute a shaky landing, but both the aircraft and passengers are safe. Everyone applauds Sylvie, savoring the moment of triumph amidst the disaster. Without delay, they split into 3 teams for different objectives. 2 men remain at the airport to handle refueling. Zara, Laura, and their group transport Matthew to the nearest hospital, while Terencio, Ayaz, and a man named Rick head to NATO headquarters. At the hospital, they encounter countless deceased bodies obstructing corridors. It appears people were aware of the impending deaths before sunrise and desperately tried to save themselves. Laura instructs everyone to ignore the chaos and focus solely on Matthew's survival. Simultaneously, Zara fills bags with medications for her son and the others. Meanwhile, at NATO headquarters, Terencio guides them to the conference room where he first learned of the crisis. Given their limited time, reviewing all papers is impossible, so Rick decides to check the surveillance footage. While Rick is occupied, Terencio mocks Ayaz's Turkish heritage, escalating into a brawl. Terencio accidentally strikes Ayaz, rendering him unconscious and causing significant bleeding. Elsewhere, Rick uncovers a recording of officials discussing a bunker beneath a dam in Bulgaria named Stara 17, the same name heard on the radio hours earlier. Before he can return to the others, Terencio intercepts him, claiming Ayaz has already departed. Rick sees Ayaz's body on screen, bleeding profusely, but is too terrified to speak. 30 minutes before sunrise, everyone boards the plane. Matthew is recovering from surgery but is not in peak condition. Terencio informs everyone that Ayaz left before them, but they can no longer afford to wait. With heavy hearts, they start the engines. Suddenly, a car screeches to a halt in front of the plane, and Ayaz emerges. In the subsequent scene, Terencio is handcuffed in the avionics bay. Sylvie warns everyone that if the Bulgaria plan fails, they lack the fuel or time for another destination. On landing, everyone must be prepared as they'll have only 20 minutes to reach the bunker's location. Ayaz is in the lavatory when he experiences a seizure. It's brief, and he attributes it to blood loss. However, he keeps this to himself. When he exits, he's asked about Terencio's fate. Unwilling to condemn him to death, he permits Terencio to accompany them to the bunker. Sometime later, they land at a Bulgarian airport and divide into 2 groups, driving separate vehicles. Sylvie pilots the first car, leading the way, while Ayaz drives the second. En route, Ayaz suffers another seizure, causing their car to crash. The first vehicle has already sped far ahead, leaving the second group no way to catch up in the remaining time. At an intersection, Sylvie turns right, arriving at a partially open gate. A passenger attempts to touch it and is thrown back by an electric shock. Furthermore, they realize someone must continuously press a button to keep the gate open. Seeking redemption, Terencio volunteers to hold the gate open for the others while Sylvie and her group proceed inside. Before leaving, Sylvie restrains him to the stand with handcuffs, ensuring he cannot betray them. This guarantees his freedom only upon the arrival of the second group. However, Ayaz and his group take a left turn at the intersection, reaching a similar gate on the opposite side of the dam. They use their clothing to scale and overcome the entrance. Ultimately, both groups converge at the bunker's main entry despite taking different routes. Military personnel finally greet the passengers, welcoming them inside and assuring them of their safety. Terencio remains outside, seeking divine forgiveness. As the sun ascends, he stands defiant, facing it, challenging it to do its worst. Ultimately, he too succumbs. To discover the fate of the surviving passengers, subscribe and stay tuned.